Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more Esoterica. Today we are going to be diving back into the works of Mrs. Helena Blavatsky. We're reading Isis Unveiled. We are on chapter 5. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. There hasn't been a whole lot of things for me to discuss thus far. I don't have the experience in those particulars, but I'm hoping that will change soon. This isn't the format for everybody, but some people seem to find enjoyment in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. But before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in the terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, where's my glasses? Let us dive in and continue our exploration of Isis Unveiled with Chapter 5. Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint. I am the spirit which still denies. Mephisto in Faust. The spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it seeth him not, neither knoweth him. Gospel according to John. Millions of spiritual creatures walk the earth, unseen, both when we wake and when we sleep. I do not have any experience with that. If you're unfamiliar, I deal in spirituality quite a bit. I believe in a lot of things, magic being included in that. And I have recently been opening myself up to these creatures. I've been like, okay, if you're out there, then make yourself known to me. I am well into several other points of spirituality, and this particular part is paying no dividends. I have had nothing that can even be construed as a spiritual creature. Doesn't mean that it won't happen. It may happen today during meditation. It may happen tomorrow during meditation, but as of yet, there has been none. Mere intellectual enlightenment cannot recognize the spiritual. As the sun puts out a fire, so spirit puts out the eyes of mere intellect. I agree with that. There has been an infinite confusion of names to express one and the same thing. The chaos of the ancients, the Zoroastrian sacred fire, or the Antisbirum of the Paris, the Hermes fire, the St. Elm's fire of the ancient Germans, the lightning of Cybele, the burning torch of Apollo, the flame on the altar of Pan, the inextinguishable fire in the temple of the Acropolis, and in that of Vesta, the fire flame of Pluto's helm, the brilliant sparks on the hat of the Dioscuri, on the Gorgon head, on the helm of Pallas, and the staff of Mercury, the Egyptian Ptah, or Ra, the Grecian Zeus Katiabates, the descending, the Pentecostal fire tongues, the burning bush of Moses, the pillar of fire of the Exodus, and the burning lamp of Abram, the eternal fire of the bottomless pit, the Delphic oracular vapors, the sidereal light of the Rosicrucians, the Akasa of the Hindu adepts, the astral light of Eliphas Levi, the nerve aura and the fluid of the magnetist, the odd of the Reichenbach, the fire globe, or meteor cat of Babinet, the psychod, the actinic force of Thury, the psychic force of Sergeant Cox and Mrs. Crooks, the atmospheric magnetism of some naturalists, galvanism, and finally electricity, are but various names for many different manifestations or effects of the same mysterious, all-pervading cause, the great Greek Archeus. Now this seems to be something about which I can talk about. The Trinity, as I view it, is made up of these three things. There is the body, which is the temple of God. It is the thing which you navigate 5D space with. The soul, which is the individualized piece of the divine, which makes the decisions for your life. That's you, if you was unaware. And then the Holy Spirit, which is the electromagnetic forces of creation. It is something that you can grab a tiny piece of control over. I have done this. It is known as the turning of the light in the golden flower, which we have done. And we talked in great detail about it in that particular study, so if you want to check that out, it will be linked. That is what he's talking about here, right? The electromagnetic forces of creation and its various manifestations. There are many different ways that it is manifested, and as of yet, I cannot throw a fireball, so I can't say that I can do that, but I have moved that energy. I have taken a small measure of control of that, and I have healed myself with it. It is God in action. Don't get it twisted, right? The Holy Spirit allows the now to become the next. It is the part that makes all of the things happen. It is the part that takes your food and changes it to fuel. It is the part that takes the oxygen and dispenses it to your blood. It is the part that when you say, I want to wiggle my fingers, it is the part that makes that happen. It is the electromagnetic forces of creation. It is every single atom in existence all at the same time, and the space between them as well. That is the electromagnetic forces of creation, called, in my estimation, the Holy Spirit. And that's what we're talking about today. So I do have a little bit of expertise in this particular section. Well, let's see what she's got to say. Sir E. Bulwer-Lytton, in his Coming Race, describes it as the vril used by the subterranean populations, and allowed his readers to take it for a fiction. These people, he says, consider that in the vril they had arrived at the unity in natural energetic agencies, and proceeds to show that Faraday intimated them under more cautious terms of correlation, thus: I have long held an opinion, almost amounting to a conviction, in common, I believe, with many other lovers of natural knowledge, that the various forms under which the forces of matter are made manifest have one common origin, the Holy Spirit, or, in other words, are so directly related and naturally dependent that they are convertible, as it were, into one another, and possess equivalents of power in their action. Absurd and unscientific as may appear our comparison of a fictitious vril, invented by the great novelist, and the primal force of the equally great experimentalist, with the Kabbalistic astral light, is nevertheless the true definition of this force. Discoveries are constantly being made to corroborate the statement thus boldly put forth. Since we began to write this part of our book, an announcement has been made in a number of papers of the supposed discovery of a new force by Mr. Edison, the electrician of Newark, New Jersey, which force seems to have little in common with electricity or galvanism, except the principle of conductivity. If demonstrated, it may remain for a long time under some pseudonymous and scientific name, but, nevertheless, it will be but one of the numerous family of children brought forth from the commencement of time by our Kabbalistic mother, the astral virgin. In fact, the discoverer says that it is as distinct and has as regular laws as heat, magnetism, or electricity. That would be the 8 laws of creation. The journal which contains the first account of the discovery adds that Mr. Edison thinks that it exists in connection with heat, and that it can also be generated by independent and as yet undiscovered means. Another of the most startling of recent discoveries is the possibility of annihilating distance between human voices by means of the telephone, distance sounder, an instrument invented by Professor A. Graham Bell. This possibility, first suggested by the little lover's telegraph, consisting of small tin cups with vellum and drug twine apparatus, by which a conversation can be carried on at a distance of 200 feet, has developed into the telephone, which will become a wonder of this age. Yeah, soon it'll become wireless and everybody will have one in their pocket. A long conversation has taken place between Boston and Cambridgeport by telegraph, every word being distinctly heard and perfectly understood, and the modulations of voices being quite distinguishable, according to the official report. The voice is seized upon, so to say, and held in form by a magnet, and the sound wave transmitted by electricity, acting in unison and cooperating with the magnet. I don't know if that's true or not. I have never deep dived into telephones and how they work. I would be interested to know if it is indeed magnetism. That would be very interesting. Electricity and magnetism is inextricably linked, so of course it runs on electricity, so it has to be tied to magnetism. But is it more magnetism than electricity is my question. The whole success depends upon a perfect control of the electric currents and the power of the magnets used, with which the former must cooperate. The invention, reports the paper, may be rudely described as a sort of trumpet, over the bell mouth of which is drawn a delicate membrane, which, when the voice is thrown into the tube, swells outward in proportion to the force of the sound wave. To the outer side of the membrane is attached a piece of metal, which, as the membrane swells outward, connects with a magnet, and this, with the electric circuit, is controlled by the operator. By some principle, not yet fully understood, the electric current transmits the sound wave just as delivered by the voice in the trumpet, and the listener, at the other end of the line, with a twin or facsimile trumpet at his ear, hears every word distinctly and readily detects the modulations of the speaker's voice. And this is one of those things that's why we hit the time frame so much, right? Because this was 1877, I believe. This might have been the earlier work in the 1850s. Regardless, it was just after the Civil War and before either of the First World Wars, right? I think this was around the time of the Spanish-American War. I think that's what it was, but I'm not the best history buff, so don't get me on that. It is interesting to note how they were looking at this technology with the retrospective lens that we have today, right? We have the knowledge that these things exist and that they indeed changed the entirety of the world and took away the distance problem of speech. Now, it raised all kinds of other problems which we are currently dealing with these days, but because of this invention, this is possible. So, definitely changed the world. Thus, in the presence of such wonderful discoveries of our age, and the further magical possibilities lying latent and yet undiscovered in the boundless realm of nature, and further, in view of the great probability that Edison's force and Professor Graham Bell's telephone may unsettle, if not utterly upset, all our ideas of the imponderable fluids, would it not be well for such persons as may be tempted to transverse our statements to wait and see whether they will be corroborated or refuted by further discoveries? Only in connection with these discoveries we may, perhaps, well remind our readers of the many hints to be found in the ancient histories as to a certain secret in the possession of the Egyptian priesthood, who could instantly communicate during the celebration of the mysteries from one temple to another, even though the former were at Thebes and the latter at the other end of the country. The legend attributing it, as a matter of course, to the invisible tribes of the air, which carry messages for mortals. The author of the pre-Adamite Man quotes an instance, which, being given merely on his own authority, and he, seeming uncertain whether the story comes from Macranius or some other writer, may be taken for what it's worth. He found good evidence, he says, during his stay in Egypt, that one of the Cleopatras sent news by a wire to all of the cities, from Heliopolis to Elephantine, on the Upper Nile. It is not so long since Professor Tyndall ushered us into a new world, peopled with airy shapes of the most ravishing beauty. The discovery consists, he says, in subjecting the vapors of volatile liquids to the action of concentrated sunlight, or to the concentrated beam of the electrical light. The vapors of certain nitrites, iodides, and acids are subjected to the action of the light in an experimental tube, lying horizontally, and so arranged that the axis of the tube and that of the parallel beams issuing from the lamp are coincident. The vapors form clouds of gorgeous tints, and arrange themselves into the shapes of vases, of bottles and cones, and nests of 6 or more, of shells of tulips, roses, sunflowers, leaves, and of involved scrolls. In one case, he tells us, the cloud bud grew rapidly into a serpent's head. A mouth was formed, and from the cloud a cord of cloud resembling a tongue was discharged. Finally, to cap the climax of the marvels, once it positively assumed the form of a fish with eyes, gills, and feelers. The two-ness of the animal form was displayed throughout, and no disc, coil, or speck existed on one side that did not exist on the other. These phenomena may possibly be explained in part by the mechanical action of a beam of light, which Mr. Crookes has recently demonstrated. For instance, it is a supposable case that the beams of light may have constituted a horizontal axis, about which the disturbed molecules of the vapors gathered into the forms of globes and spindles. But how to account for the fish, the serpent's head, the vases and flowers of different varieties, the shells? This seems to offer a dilemma to science as baffling as the meteor cat of Babinet. We do not learn that Tyndall ventured as absurd an explanation of his extraordinary phenomena as that of the Frenchman about his. Those who have not given attention to the subject may be surprised to find how much was known in the former days of that all-pervading, subtle principle which has recently been baptized the universal ether, or the Holy Spirit. Before proceeding, we desire once more to enunciate in two categorical propositions what was hinted at before. These propositions were demonstrated laws with the ancient theurgists. 1. The so-called miracles, to begin with Moses and end with Calixto, when genuine, whereas de Gasperin very justly insinuates in his work on the phenomena, perfectly in accordance with natural law, hence no miracles. Electricity and magnetism were unquestionably used in the production of some of the prodigies, but now, the same as then, they are put in requisition by every sensitive who is made to use unconsciously these powers by the peculiar nature of his or her organization, which serves as a conductor for some of these imponderable fluids, as yet so imperfectly known to science. This force is the prolific parent of numberless attributes and properties, many, or rather most of which are as yet unknown to modern physics. 2. The phenomena of natural magic be witnessed in Siam, India, Egypt, and other Oriental countries bear no relationship whatever to sleight of hand, the one being an absolute physical effect due to the action of occult natural forces, the other a mere deceptive result obtained by dexterous manipulations supplemented with confederacy. The thaumaturgists of all periods, schools, and countries produced their wonders because they were perfectly familiar with the imponderable in their effects, but otherwise perfectly tangible waves of astral light. They controlled the currents by guiding them with their willpower. The wonders were both of physical and psychological character, the former embracing effects produced upon material objects, and the latter the mental phenomena of Mesmer and his successors. This class has been represented in our time by two illustrious men, Dupotet and Regazzoni, whose wonderful powers were attested in France and other countries. Mesmerism is the most important branch of magic, and its phenomena, and the effects of the universal agent which underlies all magic, and has produced at all ages the so-called miracles. Now, I am unfamiliar with mesmerism being used in this particular connotation. This is not, like, mesmerism to me is synonymous with hypnotism. It is the bringing down into a subjective state and subjecting the discourse, right? Like making subliminal suggestions to someone under hypnotic effects, to me, as mesmerism. If I am wrong in that, this is the first time I am aware that that is used in a different context. The most important branch of magic, I would say no, if it is what I am saying, but maybe it is something different that I need to investigate further. If you know of a different resource that would bring me a better enlightenment, leave that in the box down below. But as for being the most important branch, if it is indeed the outside influence of hypnotism, it is no. That is a hard no. Can it be useful? Yes. Is it subjective? Absolutely. And it is more difficult to achieve the results that you want by someone else enacting them upon you. Hypnotism can work for quitting smoking, for instance, but you have to be committed to that prior to. And that is putting the suggestion in your mind that you really want to. Right? You already say you want to. You're already taking the actions. And it is a boost. It is something that clears the subconscious and takes it out. Placing anything that is outside of your already predetermined will through subjective powers is going to not just not work, but it is going to backfire with severe repercussions upon the person attempting to do it. Now, its phenomenon being the effects of the universal agent which relies all the magic and has produced, that is possible, right? You can self-suggest. That is much more effective. You can place yourself into the same state. That is what you do when you meditate, at least in the way in which I describe it in the way that I do things. You are putting yourself into that subjective state, but you're doing it for yourself, and you're placing those subconscious cues for yourself, and that is much more effective. It is utilizing the spirit in order to do that. By placing yourself into the meditative state, you are already using the spirit for subjection, for changing the unconscious. All right, back to the text. The ancients called it chaos. Plato and the Pythagoreans named it the soul of the world. According to the Hindus, the deity in the shape of ether pervades all things. It is the invisible, but, as we have said before, too tangible fluid. Among other names, this universal Proteus, or nebulous almighty, as de Mirville calls it in derision, was termed by the theurgist the living fire, the spirit of light, and magnes. This last appellation indicates its magnetic properties and shows its magical nature. And that is, I talk about it being the electromagnetic forces of creation, because when you are doing the work, right, you're doing the pulling of the energies, it is a magnetic effect. It is literally pulling energy into you. And so, yes, I absolutely agree with that. For, as truly expressed by one of its enemies, I don't know Greek, are two branches of growing from the same trunk and shooting forth the same results. Magnetism is a word for the derivation of which we have to look to an incredibly early epoch. The stone called magnet is believed by many to owe its name to Magnesia, a city or district in Thessaly, where these stones were found in quantity. We believe, however, the opinion of the Hermeticists to be the correct one. The word magus, is derived from the Sanskrit magi, the great or wise, the appointed by the divine wisdom. Eumolpus is the mythic founder of the Eumolpiad, the priests. The priests trace their own wisdom to the divine intelligence. The various cosmogonies show that the archaeo-universal soul was held by every nation as a mind of the demiurgic creator, the Sophia of the Gnostics, or the Holy Ghost as a female principle. As the Magi derived their name from it, so the Magnesian stone, or magnet, was called in their honor, for they were the first to discover its wonderful properties. Their temples dotted the country in all directions, and among these were some temples of Hercules. Hence, the stone, when it became known that the priests used it for their curative and magical properties, received the name of the Magnesian or Herculean stone. Socrates, speaking of it, remarks, Euripides calls it the Magnesian stone, but the common people, the Heraclean. It was the country and stone which were called after the Magi, not the Magi after one or the other. Pliny informs us that the wedding ring among the Romans was magnetized by the priests before the ceremony. The old pagan historians are careful to keep silent on certain mysteries of the wise Magi, and Pausanias was warned in a dream, he says, not to unveil the holy rites of the temple of Demeter and Persephone at Athens. Modern science, after having ineffectually denied animal magnetism, has found herself forced to accept it as a fact. It is now a recognized property of human and animal organization. As to its psychological, occult influence, the academies battle with it, in our century, more ferociously than ever. It is the more to be regretted and even wondered at, as the representatives of exact science are unable to either explain or even offer us anything like a reasonable hypothesis for the undeniable, mysterious potency contained in a simple magnet. We began to have daily proofs that these potencies underlie the theurgic mysteries, and therefore might, perhaps, explain the occult faculties possessed by ancient and modern thaumaturgists, as well as a good many of their most astounding achievements. Such were the gifts transmitted by Jesus to some of his disciples. At the moment of his miraculous cures, the Nazarene felt a power issuing from him. We talked about that in the Bible study. Socrates, in his dialogue with Theages, telling him of his familiar god, demon, and his power of either imparting his, Socrates, wisdom to his disciples or preventing it from benefiting those he associates with, brings the following instance in corroboration of his words. I will tell you, Socrates, says Aristides, a thing incredible indeed by the gods, but true. I made a proficiency when I associated with you, even if it was only in the same house, though not in the same room, but more so when I was in the same room, and much more when I looked at you. But I made by far the greatest proficiency when I sat near you and touched you. This is the modern magnetism and mesmerism of Dupotet and other masters, who, when they have subjected a person to their fluidic influence, can impart to them all their thoughts, even at a distance. And, with an irresistible power force, they're subject to obey their mental orders. I also have a small bit of this, right? This is bordering on telepathy. Well, it isn't even bordering. This is talking about telepathy. I cannot hold full conversations. Make that abundantly clear. But I have called my wife from another room using nothing but my mind. I intended to do so. I let the energy out with the intention of it happening, and it happened immediately, and not just on a single occasion, but on several. I couldn't do anything besides just get her attention and make her come to me, right? Because I don't play with consent like some people do. But I was able to do that. That is something that I have been able to do through the manipulation of these electromagnetic forces of creation, which I call the Holy Spirit. And so I don't doubt this part either at all, right? Now, I follow the 8 laws of creation. That is a foundational thing. That was a direct revelation to me. It is something that I adhere to. And part of that is consent, right? The law of returns, part of that is that if you are doing things that are misaligned, the intent is the multiplicative factor there. So if you are doing things without consent, that's the multiplier that's coming. I don't like that multiplier. I don't deal with that. I do very little outside of a consent situation. And so I'm not trying to give orders, right? It may be possible that I could do something along those natures, but it is not something I am even willing to dive into. So, like the calling, that's different, right? It's no different than if I was to call her name. I didn't say, hey, come here. All I did was send the name, and she heard it and was like, what? I was silent. I didn't say anything. And she was in a different room. She didn't see me make a gesture, right? That's the difference here, and I want to be very clear that consent is a major issue, right? It's not some little minor thing that you can just bump past. Consent will get you where most of the other things won't. Back to the text. But how far better was this psychic force known to the ancient philosophers? We can glean some information on that subject from the earliest sources. Pythagoras taught his disciples that God is the universal mind diffused through all things, and that this mind, by the sole virtue of its universal sameness, could be communicated from one object to another and be made to create all things by the sole willpower of man. That may very well be the mechanics behind it, right? Like all things are one, that is the very first law of creation. We are all individualized pieces of the divinity, but none of us actually divine in and of ourselves. And as individualized pieces of the divinity, we are still connected to the divinity, right? We may be the individual expression of the divinity, but I am and you are too. We share that one common source. Now, I hold that the Holy Spirit is the all-pervading force that connects us all together. I have seen that in my revelatory experience. And that is why I don't disagree with this, right? I think that this may very well be the actual way that it happens. When I talk to my wife using mental, it may very well have went up and then back down, or it could have carried through the Holy Spirit directly. I don't know, and I don't even know how to experiment with that particular part of it. I don't know that that's even necessary for an understanding, but that definitely works as a theory. Back to the text. With the ancient Greeks, kurios was the god mind, nous. Now, koros, kurios, signifies the pure and unmixed nature of intellect, wisdom. Now, this pure and unmixed, I don't necessarily agree with that, right? Wisdom is the practical practical application of intelligence. So, what you do is you learn things. That is intelligence. The ability to learn a new thing is the intelligence. The ability to put that into practical application is wisdom. You can know all kinds of things and not be able to do things, and then you don't have wisdom. You can do all kinds of things and never have went to school a day in your life. That is wisdom. That is applying the things which you learn, which does not have to come from a school, into practical everyday life. It is entirely possible to be wise even if you are not intelligent. There are people, I hold a special place for special needs, so don't take this wrong, but people who are chromosomally different, right? You have Downs and situations like that. Those people can have a great deal of wisdom, even if they can't really learn in the same manner that we do as normally chromosomed people, right? And so it is possible to have wisdom without intellect, but it's extremely hard, right? The wisdom that is expressed is going to be more of an earthy nature and less of a philosophical nature. Back to the text. Says Plato, Kurios is Mercury, the divine wisdom, and Mercury is the soul, the sun, from whom thought Tehote, Hermes, received the divine wisdom, which, in his turn, he imparted to the world in his books. Hercules is also the sun, the celestial storehouse of the universal magnetism. Or rather, Hercules is the magnetic light, which, when having made its way through the opened eye of heaven, enters into the regions of our planet and thus becomes the creator. Hercules passes through all the 12 labors. The valiant Titan, he is called father of all and self-born. Hercules, the sun, is killed by the devil, Typhon. I'm going to stop because this eye of heaven, right? I don't know that this is actually going to be the sun. I think that the eye of heaven is going to be the sidereal light. And if you don't have the experience of the flower unfolding, the light, the golden light, which is the pervading thing that they're talking about in metaphysics, then you would mistake it for the sun, but it is not the sun. In my estimation, that is without some deep diving knowledge of this, right? It is like the sun. It really is. Like you can be in a dark room doing the meditation and the light appears to you and it is blinding. You're like recoiling from it. It is hard to focus. It is hard to maintain your composure because it is so overwhelmingly blinding. It looks like as if you were to stare at the sun. Without the damaging effects, don't stare at the sun. That causes severe problems. So this could be talking about the actual sun, but it also could be talking about the subtle, ethereal, sidereal light. Just wanted to point that out because it leaped out and I don't know that we'll have a place later on to put it in there. So, Hercules, the sun, is killed by the devil, Typhon. And so is Osiris, who is the father and brother of Horus, and at the same time is identical with him. And we must not forget that the magnet was called the bone of Horus, and iron, the bone of Typhon. He is called Hercules Invictus only when he descends to Hades, the subterranean garden, and plucking the golden apples from the tree of life, slays the dragon. The rough titanic power, the lining of every sun god, opposes its force of blind matter to the divine magnetic spirit, which tries to harmonize everything in nature. All the sun gods, with their symbol, the visible sun, are the creators of physical nature only. The spiritual is the work of the highest God, the concealed, the central spiritual sun, and of his demiurge, the divine mind of Plato, and the divine wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, the wisdom effused from Olam or Kronos. After the distribution of pure fire in the Samothracian mysteries, a new life began. This was the new birth that is alluded to by Jesus in his nocturnal conversation with Nicodemus. Initiated into the most blessed of all mysteries, being ourselves pure, we become just and holy with wisdom. He breathed on them and saith unto them, Take the holy pneuma. And this simple act of willpower was sufficient to impart vaticination in its nobler and most perfect form, if both the initiator and the initiated were worthy of it. That's not a quote. Oh, my bad. To deride this gift, even in its present aspect, as the corrupt offspring and lingering remains of an ignorant age of superstition, and hastily to condemn it as unworthy of sober investigation, would be as unphilosophical as it is wrong, remarks the Reverend J.B. Gross. To remove the veil which hides our vision from the future has been attempted in all ages of the world, and therefore the propensity to pry into the lap of time, contemplated as one of the faculties of the human mind, comes recommended to us under the sanction of God. Zuinglius, the Swiss reformer, attested to comprehend. Again, I'm not in a quote. I keep missing a quote somewhere, or the quotation marks. The Swiss reformer attested the comprehensiveness of his faith in the providence of the Supreme Being, in the cosmopolitan doctrine that the Holy Ghost was not excluded from the more worthy portion of the heathen world. Admitting its truth, we cannot easily conceive a valid reason why a heathen, thus favored, should not be capable of true prophecy. I guess it was part of a quote. I try to do the quotes in a different voice just to keep it a little bit interesting. Now, plus this is vocal therapy. Now, what is this mystic, primordial substance? In the book of Genesis, at the beginning of the first chapter, it is termed the face of the waters, said to have been incubated by the Spirit of God. Job mentions it in chapter 26:5, that dead things are formed from under the waters and inhabitants thereof. In the original text, instead of dead things, it is written dead Rephaim, giants or mighty primitive men, from whom evolution may one day trace our present race. In the Egyptian mythology, Kneph, the eternal, unrevealed God, is represented by a snake emblem of eternity encircling a water urn, with his head hovering above over the waters, which it incubates with its breath. In this case, the serpent is the Agatha demon, the good spirit. In its opposite aspect is the cocoa demon, the bad one. In the Scandinavian Eddas, the honeydew, the food of the gods and of the creative busy Yggdrasil, bees, falls during the hours of night, when the atmosphere is impregnated with humidity, and in the northern mythologies, as the passive principle of creation, it typifies the creation of the universe out of water. This dew is the astral light in one of its combinations and possesses creative as well as destructive properties. In the Chaldean legend of Berosus, Oans, or Dagon, the man-fish, instructing the people, shows the infant world created out of water and all beings originating from this prima materia. Moses teaches that only earth and water can bring a living soul, and we read in the scriptures that herbs could not grow until the eternal caused it to rain upon the earth. In the Mexican Popol Vuh, man is created out of mud or clay. teraglas, it taken from under the water. Brahma creates Lomas, the great Muni, or first man, seated on his lotus, only after having called him into being. Spirits, who thus enjoyed among mortals a priority of existence, and he creates him out of water, air, and earth. Alchemists claim that primordial, or pre-Adamic earth, when reduced to its first substance, is in its second stage of transformation, like clear water, the first being the alkahest proper. This primordial substance is said to contain within itself the essence of all that goes to make up man. It has not only all the elements of his physical being, but even the breath of life itself in a latent state, ready to be awakened. This it derives from the incubation of the Spirit of God upon the face of the waters, chaos. In fact, this substance is chaos itself. From this it was that Paracelsus claimed to be able to make his homunculi, and this is why Thales, the great natural philosopher, maintained that water was the principle of all things in nature. What is the primordial chaos but ether? The modern ether, not such as is recognized by our scientists, but such as it was known to the ancient philosophers, long before the time of Moses. Ether, with all its mysterious and occult properties, containing in itself the germ of universal creation. Ether, the celestial virgin, the spiritual mother of every existing form and being, from whose bosom, as soon as incubated by the divine spirit, are called into existence matter and life, force and action. Electricity, magnetism, heat, light, and chemical action are so little understood even now that fresh facts are constantly widening the range of our knowledge. Who knows where ends the power of the protean giant, ether, or whence its mysterious origin? Who, we mean, that denies the spirit that works in it and evolves out of it all visible forms. It is an easy task to show that the cosmogonical legends all over the world are based on the knowledge by the ancients of those sciences which have allied themselves in our days to support the doctrine of evolution, and that further research may demonstrate that they were far better acquainted with the fact of evolution itself, embracing both its physical and spiritual aspects, than we are now. With the old philosophers, evolution was a universal theorem, a doctrine embracing the whole as an established principle, while our modern evolutionists are enabled to present us merely with speculative theoretics, with particular if not wholly negative theorems. It is idle for the representatives of our modern wisdom to close the debate and pretend that the question is settled, merely because the obscure phraseology of the Mosaic account clashes with the definite exegesis of exact science. One fact, at least, is proved. There is not a cosmogonical fragment, to whatever nation it may belong, but proves by this universal allegory of water and spirit brooding over it, that no more than our modern physicists did any of them hold the universe to have sprung into existence out of nothing. For all their legends begin with that period when nascent vapors and Cimmerian darkness lay brooding over the fluid mass, ready to start on his journey of activity at the first flutter of the breath of him, who is the unrevealed one. Him they felt, if they saw him not. Their spiritual intuitions were not so darkened by the subtle sophistry of the forthcoming ages as ours are now. If they talked less of the Silurian age slowly developing into the mammalian, and if the Cenozoic time was only recorded by various allegories of the primitive man, the Adam of our race, it is but a negative proof, after all, that their wise men and leaders did not know of these successive periods as well as we do now. In the days of Democritus and Aristotle, the cycle had already begun to enter on its downward path of progress. And if these two philosophers could discuss so well the atomic theory and trace the atom to its material or physical point, their ancestors may have gone farther still and followed its genesis far beyond that limit where Mr. Tyndall and others seem rooted to the spot. not daring to cross the line of the incomprehensible. The lost arts are a sufficient proof that even in their achievements in physiography are now doubted because of the unsatisfactory writings of their physicists and naturalists. On the other hand, their practical knowledge in phytochemistry and mineralogy far exceed our own. Furthermore, they might have been perfectly acquainted with the physical history of our globe without publishing their knowledge to the ignorant masses in those ages of religious mysteries. Well, we have this, and I have an explanation for this, but I'm not sure we're going to get into it today. Therefore, it is not only from the Mosaic book that we mean to adduce proof for our further arguments. The ancient Jews got all their knowledge, religious as well as profane, from the nations with which we see them mixed up from the earliest periods. Even the oldest of all sciences, their Kabbalistic secret doctrine, may be traced in each detail to its primeval source, Upper India or Turkestan, far before the time of distinct separation between the Aryan and Semitic nations. The King Solomon, so celebrated by posterity, as Josephus the historian says, for his magical skill, got his secret learnings from India through Hiram, the king of Ophir, and perhaps Sheba. His reign, commonly known as Solomon's Seal, so celebrated for the potency of its sway over the various kinds of genii and demons in all the popular legends, is equally of Hindu origin. Riding on the pretentious and abominable skill of the devil worshippers of Travancore, the Reverend Samuel Matier of the London Missionary Society claims at the same time to be in possession of a very old manuscript volume of magical incantations and spells in the Malayalam language, giving directions for effecting a great variety of purposes. Of course, he adds, that many of these are fearful in their malignity and obscenity, and gives in his work the facsimile of some amulets bearing the magical figures and designs on them. We find among them one with the following legend: to remove trembling arising from demoniacal possession, write this figure on a plant that has milky juice, and drive a nail through it. The trembling will cease. That is a tool. Tools hold no power by themselves. The figure is the identical Solomon's Seal, or double triangle of the Kabbalist. Did the Hindu get it from the Jewish Kabbalist, or the latter from India, by inheritance from their great king Kabbalist, the wise Solomon? But we will leave this trifling dispute to continue more interesting questions of the astral light and its unknown properties. Admitting, then, that this mythical agent is ether, we will proceed to see what and how much of it is known to science. Nowadays, ether is better known as plasma. There is light and dark plasma. Dark plasma is inactive. That is what space mainly consists of. With respect to the various effects of the different solar rays, Robert Hunt, FRS, remarks in his researches on light and its chemical relations that those rays which give the most light, the yellow and orange rays, will not produce change of color in the chloride of silver, while those rays which have the least illuminating power, the blue and the violet, produce the greatest change, and in exceedingly short time the yellow glasses obstruct scarcely any light. The blue glasses may be so dark as to admit of the permeation of a very small quantity. We understand nowadays light theory and why the ultraviolet is a little bit different, right? And still we see that under the blue ray both vegetable and animal life manifest an inordinate development, while under the yellow ray it is proportionally arrested. How is it possible to account for this satisfactorily upon any other hypothesis that is both animal and vegetable life are differently modified electromagnetic phenomena, as yet unknown in their fundamental principles? This is something else that I have a little bit of experience in. I grow plants. I have plants growing in one of my rooms in my house. I have a setup with different lights. And plants vegetate better under ultraviolet light. The blues and the reds as opposed to the yellows and the whites. But whenever you go into the flowering stage of various plants, they benefit more then from the brighter lights. It is a change in the chemical makeup of the plant itself. They still respond to the darker lights, but without the lighter lights, the fruit doesn't fill as much. So there is definitely a difference in the effect of the light upon the plant depending upon the spectrum in which it is produced. That is an absolute truth. Mr. Hunt finds that the undulatory theory does not account for the results of his experiments. Sir David Brewster, in his treatise on optics, showing that the colors of vegetable life arise from a specific attraction which the particles of these bodies exercise over differently colored rays of light, and that it is by the light of the sun that the colored juices of plants are elaborated, that the colors of bodies are changed, etc. Remarks that it is not easy to allow that such effects can be produced by the mere vibration of an ethereal medium. And he is forced, he says, by this class of facts to reason as if light was material. It is, indeed. Light has weight. Professor Josiah P. Cook of Harvard University says that he cannot agree with those who regard the wave theory of light as an established principle of science. It is both a wave and a particle. Herschel's doctrine that the intensity of light in effect of each undulation is inversely as the square of the distance from the luminous body, if correct, damages a good deal if it does not kill the undulatory theory. That he is right was proved repeatedly by experiments with photometers, and though it begins to be much doubted, the undulatory theory is still alive. This was prior to the box slit theory, right? If you are unfamiliar, there was I'm drawing a blank on the word, a practical application of theory, the testing of the theory. Like, bleh. For some reason, I can't pull the word out, but they tested the theory of whether light was a particle or a wave, and it turns out that it is both, depending on how you observe it. They put a slot in a box, and it's a whole procedure. You should definitely check it out if you're unfamiliar, but this was prior to that, and they were unsure, right? They were like, well, it seems to move in a wave, but there are other things that seem as though not. That is because it is both true. As General Pleasanton of Philadelphia has undertaken to combat this anti-Pythagorean hypothesis, and has devoted to it a whole volume, we cannot do any better than to refer the reader to his recent work on the Blu-ray, etc. We leave the theory of Thomas Young, who, according to Tyndall, placed on an immovable basis the undulatory theory of light, to hold its own, if it can, with the Philadelphia experimenter. Eliphas Levi, the modern magician, describes the astral light in the following sentence. We have said that to acquire magical power, two things are necessary: to disengage the will from all servitude, and to exercise it in control. Yes. Well, I wouldn't say all servitude, right? You are still at service to creation. But, yeah. The sovereign will is represented in our symbols by the woman who crushes the serpent's head, and by the resplendent angel who represses the dragon, and holds him under his foot and spear. The great magical agent, the dual current of light, the living and astral fire of the earth, has been represented in the ancient theogonies by the serpent with the head of a bull, a ram or a dog. It is the double serpent of the caduceus. It is the old serpent of the Genesis. But it is also the brazen serpent of Moses entwined about the Tau, that is to say, the generative Lingha. It is also the goat of the witch Sabbath, and the Baphomet of the Templars. It is the Hyle of the Gnostics, and the double-tailed serpent, which forms the legs of the scarlet cock of Abraxas. Finally, it is the devil of Emudes de Mirville. But in very fact it is the blind force which souls have to conquer to liberate themselves from the bonds of the earth. For if their will does not free, them from this fatal attraction, they will be absorbed in the current by the force which has produced them, and will return to the central and eternal fire. I don't know that I necessarily agree with the phraseology here, right? You are not meant to separate yourself completely, right? Your will is not going to free you from the fatal attraction. It will give you the ability to manipulate these electromagnetic forces of creation, which is the Holy Spirit. But you are not meant to be separated from that. It is an intrinsic part of yourself. It is something to accept about yourself, not to fight against. We are not on a prison planet. There is no need for a liberation from the bonds of the earth. We are here in a voluntary incarnation. You are here on purpose. It is not an accident that you are here. You are not condemned to life on earth, even though this is most likely hell, right? You will return to the central and eternal fire. Yeah, you will. That central and eternal fire is the Holy Spirit. And when you are done with your temple, it will decompose. But the soul, the part of you that is individualized from the divine, will return to the divine. It really is that simple. This last Kabbalistic figure of speech, notwithstanding its strange phraseology, most people don't use phraseology, normally it's just me, that's funny, is precisely the one used by Yeshua, and in his mind it could have had no other significance than the one attributed to it by the Gnostics and the Kabbalists. Later, the Christian theologians interpreted it differently, and with them it became the doctrine of hell. Literally, though, it simply means what it says, the astral light, or the generator and destroyer of all forms. All the magical operations, continues Levi, consist in freeing oneself from the coils of the ancient serpent, then to place the foot on its head and lead it according to the operator's will. I will give unto thee, says the serpent in the gospel myth, all the kingdoms of the earth, if thou wilt fall down and worship me. The initiate should reply to him, I will not fall down, but thou shalt crouch at my feet. Thou wilt give me nothing, but I will make use of thee and take whatever I wish, for I am thy Lord and Master. That's not entirely untrue, right? The serpent, the beginning of this, is going to start at the base, right? That is where the alliteration for stepping on the head and all of that's coming from. The base is tied in with the feet, right? Just the same way that the heart is tied in with the hands. And so, yes, but there are two forces, right? If you are only working with the one force coming up, you are doing it wrong. You are missing half of the equation. There is another force coming down. And so the serpent, yes, take control, do the things. But it is only part of the process. There is another part that must be intrinsic to it, right? For every positive, there has to be a negative. For every penetration, there has to be the grounding and acceptance. That is physics. That is how it works. But you are, through this process, taking the Lord and Master upon yourself, right? The entire process, which is part of the Infinite Integrations playlist, we go through a lot of things in there, but this is definitely in that. That process is becoming the master of yourself, right? I have healed myself through this. I have affected things outside of myself through this. That is taking mastery of it. Does that mean I am a master of it? No. I am still working. I am still practicing. I meditate pretty much every day. I try to every day, but sometimes life happens. That process is the taking the mastery, but there is definitely a point at which you have to assume that title, even if you are not necessarily ready for it. You have to say that I am in charge of this. And once you do that, you really become that. Does not mean that you will have complete mastery from that point. This is the real meaning of the ambiguous response made by Jesus to the tempter. Thus, the devil is not an entity. It is an errant force, as the name signifies, a noetic or magnetic current, formed by a chain, a circle, of pernicious wills must create this evil spirit which the gospel calls legion, and which forces into the sea a herd of swine. Another evangelical allegory showing how base natures can be driven headlong by the blind forces set in motion by error and sin. I'm not even going to touch that. We have dealt with things like that in the Bible study. In his extensive work on the mystical manifestations of the human nature, the German naturalist and philosopher Maximilian Perti has devoted a whole chapter to the modern forms of magic. The manifestations of magical life, he says in his preface, partially repose on quite another order of things than the nature in which we are acquainted with time, space, and causality. These manifestations can be experimented with but little. They cannot be called out to do our bidding, but may be observed and carefully followed whenever they occur in our presence. That is not true. They can be called out. We can only group them by analogy under certain divisions and deduce from them general principles and laws. Thus, for Professor Perti, who evidently belongs to the school of Schopenhauer, the possibility and naturalness of this phenomena, which took place in the presence of Kavandasamy, the fakir, are described by Louis Joliot, the Orientalist, are fully demonstrated on that principle. The fakir was a man who, through the entire subjugation of the matter of his corporeal system, has attained to that state of purification at which the spirit becomes nearly freed from its prison and can produce wonders. His will, nay, a simple desire of his, has become a creative force, and he can command the elements and powers of nature. His body is no more an impediment to him. Hence, he can converse, spirit to spirit, breath to breath. Under his extended palms, a seed, unknown to him, for Joliot has chosen it at random among a variety of seeds from a bag, and planted it himself, after marking it in a flower pot, will germinate instantly and push its way through the soil, developing in less than 2 hours' time to a size and height which, perhaps under ordinary circumstances, would require several days or weeks. It grows miraculously under the very eyes of the perplexed experimenter, and mockingly upsets every accepted formula in botany. I do not doubt that this is a true thing that is possible, but it again goes into consent, and that is therefore one of those things I don't really mess with. I strengthen my plants. You may not believe that. I don't even care. I practice the purification and the strengthening of the magnetic fields of other things without trying to alter the natural course of things, which is a little bit hard to understand. I will not tell a plant, I need you to grow and bloom within an hour. I don't doubt that that is possible, but it gets into reverberations in the A laws of creation. But by investing my energy into strengthening the plant, I make a better root system. I make it uptake the nutrients in a little bit better of a fashion. But I'm not trying to stretch the natural bounds of what it is supposed to do. I have, as far as I am concerned, a 100% success rate with it. I have taken plants from the same seed batch, planted them side by side, and used the method on one side and not the other, right? I know it's not double blind, but it's whatever. It's good enough for me. And through that process, I have attained better results. Better yields, better growth patterns, better absorption of moisture and nutrients. Like everything works better through the method by which I do it. It is intensive. It takes effort, concentration, and will. And those things can wear you out. It is something that will degrade on your body. So it is something to definitely not try to scale to like industrial farming. And as far as I'm concerned, that would probably be a bit much. But for a garden, right, a decent medium-sized garden is going to put a lot of work in, but it will definitely yield, at least in my estimation. Back to the text. Is this a miracle? By no means. It may be one, perhaps, if we take Webster's definition that a miracle is every event contrary to the established constitution and course of things, a deviation from the known laws of nature. That's why I don't fuck with it. But are naturalists prepared to support the claim that what they have once established on observation is infallible? Or that every law of nature is known to them? In this instance, the miracle is but a little more prominent than now well-known experiments of General Pleasanton of Philadelphia. While the vegetation and fruitage of his vines were stimulated to an incredible activity by the artificial violet light, the magnetic fluid emanating from the hands of the fakir affected still more intense and rapid changes in the vital function of the Indian plants. It attracted and concentrated the akasa, or life principle, on the germ. His magnetism, obeying his will, drew up the akasa in a concentrated current through the plant towards his hands. And really, that is the opposite of how I do it. That is interesting. I might have to play with that a little bit. I'm not trying to alter the natural course of events, but that is an interesting energy flow I normally don't mess with a whole lot, and I might try that. And by keeping up in an uninterrupted flow for the requisite space of time, the life principle of the plant built up cell after cell, layer after layer, with preternatural activity until the work was done. The life principle is but a blind force obeying a controlling influence. In the ordinary course of nature, the plant protoplasm would have concentrated and directed it at a certain established rate. This rate would have been controlled by the prevalent atmospheric conditions, its growth being rapid or slow and, in stalk or head, in proportion to the amount of light, heat, and moisture of the season. But the fakir, coming to the help of nature with his powerful will and spirit purified from the contact with matter, condenses, so to speak, the essence of plant life into its germ and forces to its maturity ahead of its time. This blind force, being totally submissive to his will, obeys it with servility. If he chose to imagine the plant as a monster, it would surely become such, as ordinarily it would grow in its natural shape, for the concrete image, slave to the subjective model outlined in the imagination of the fakir, is forced to follow the original in its least detail, as the hand and brush of the painter follows the image which they copy from his mind. The will of the fakir conjurer forms an invisible, but yet two-edged, perfectly objective matrix, in which the vegetable matter is caused to deposit itself and assume the fixed shape. The will creates, for the will in motion is force, and force produces matter. If some persons object to the explanation on the ground that the fakir could by no means create the model in his imagination, since he was kept ignorant by Jacqueliot of the kind of seed he had selected for the experiment, to these we will answer that the spirit of man is not like that of his creator, omniscient in its essence. While in his natural state the fakir did not and could not know whether it was a melon seed or seed of any other plant, once entranced, in example, bodily dead to all outward appearance, the spirit, for which there is neither distance, material obstacle, nor space of time, experienced no difficulty in perceiving the melon seed, whether as it lay deeply buried in the mud of the flower pot, or reflected in the faithful picture gallery of Jacquelot's brain. Our visions, portents, and other psychological phenomena, all of which exist in nature, are corroborative of the above fact. And now, perhaps, we might as well meet at once another impending objection. Indian jugglers. They will tell us do the same as well as the fakir if we can believe newspapers and travelers' narratives. Undoubtedly so. And moreover, these strolling jugglers are neither pure in their modes of living nor considered holy by anyone, neither by foreigners or their own people. That is another thing that I try to point out, is there is tied through the various control systems this need for purification. That's not necessary, right? You can do the things that I do while eating a normal meal. You don't have to abstain from sex. You don't have to be chaste and pure, right? That is not, in my experience, a requirement. It can be helpful for short periods of time to fast, right? We talk about prayer, fasting, and meditation all the time. Fasting is powerful. It works for the purification of soul, yes, but for the ability of your 5D temple to understand the instructions coming from the Holy Spirit. Abstaining from food or sex or drugs or whatever it is can be a handy tool, but tools are not necessary, right? They can be needed at certain points, but they aren't something that you have to have in order to do the thing. And so that is something that I wanted to point out too, because I eat meat. I love meat. I eat it all the time, and I doubt very seriously I will ever be a vegetarian. I like sex. I engage in it all the time, as much as my wife will allow me to, right? It is not you have to be chaste. It is not you have to swear off sex. It is not you cannot eat meat. It is not you cannot eat vegetables. Whatever it is that people are telling you you have to place in between you and the spirit is not necessary. Back to the text. They are generally feared and despised by the natives, for they are sorcerers, men practicing the black art. While such a holy man as a Kavandasami requires but the help of his own divine soul, closely united with the astral spirit, and the help of a few familiar Pitris, pure ethereal beings, who rally around their elect brother in the flesh, the sorcerer can summon to his help but that class of spirits which we know as the elementals. Like attracts like. That is the law of attraction, the fourth law of creation. And greed for money, impure purposes, and selfish views cannot attract any other spirits than those that the Hebrew Kabbalists know as the Qlippoth, dwellers of Osaya, the fourth world, and the Eastern magicians as the Afrits, or elementary spirits of error, or the deaths. Now, I would say, in my estimation, that it's not the fourth world, but instead the sixth, and possibly the seventh, but most likely the sixth. This is how an English paper describes the astounding trick of plant growth as performed by Indian jugglers. An empty flower pot was now placed upon the floor by the juggler, who requested that his comrades might be allowed to bring up some garden mold from the little plot of ground below. Permission being accorded, the man went, and in 2 minutes returned with a small quantity of fresh earth tied up in a corner of his chutter, which was deposited in the flower pot and lightly pressed down, taking from his basket a dry mango stone and handing it around to the company that they might examine it, and satisfy themselves that it was really what it seemed to be. The juggler scooped out a little earth from the center of the flower pot and placed the stone in the cavity. He then turned the earth lightly over it, and having poured a little water over the surface, shut the flower pot out of view by means of a sheet thrown over a small triangle. And now, amid a full chorus of voices and rat-tat-tat accompanied of the tabor, the stone germinated. Presently a section of the cloth was drawn aside and gave to view the tender shoot, characterized by 2 long leaves of blackish-brown color. The cloth was readjusted, and the incantation resumed. Not long was it, however, before the cloth was a second time drawn aside, and it was seen then seen that the 2 first leaves had given place to several green ones, and that the plant now stood 9 or 10 inches in height. A third time, and the foliage was much thicker, the sapling being about 13 to 14 inches in height. A fourth time, and the little miniature tree, now about 18 inches in height, had 10 or 12 mangoes, about the size of walnuts, hanging about its branches. Finally, after the lapse of 3 or 4 minutes, the cloth was altogether removed, and the fruit, having the perfection of size, though not of maturity, was plucked and handed to the spectators, and on being tasted was found to be approaching ripeness, being sweetly acid. We may add to this that we have witnessed the same experiment in India and Tibet, and that more than once we provided the flower pot ourselves by emptying an old tin box of some Liebherg extracts. We filled it with earth with our own hands and planted in it a small root handed to us by the conjurer. And until the experiment was ended, never once removed our eyes from the pot, which was placed in our own room. The results were invariably the same as above described. Does the reader imagine that any prestidigitator could produce the same manifestation under the same conditions? The learned Orioli, corresponding member of the Institute of France, gives a number of instances which show the marvelous effects produced by the willpower acting upon the invisible Proteus of the mesmerists. I have seen, he says, certain persons who simply by pronouncing certain words arrest wild bulls and horses at headlong speed, and suspend in its flight the arrow which cleaves the air. Thomas Bartholini affirms the same. Says Duputet, when I trace upon the floor with chalk or charcoal this figure, a fire, a light fixes itself on it. Soon it attracts to itself the person who approaches it. It detains and fascinates him, and it is useless for him to try to cross the line. A magic power compels him to stand still. At the end of a few moments he yields, uttering sobs. The cause is not in me, it is in this entirely cabalistic sign. In vain would you employ violence. In a series of remarkable experiments made by Regazzoni in the presence of certain well-known French physicians, at Paris on the 18th of May, 1856. They assembled on one night together, and Regazzoni, with his finger, traced an imaginary cabalistic line upon the floor, over which he made a few rapid passes. It was agreed that the mesmeric subjects, selected by the investigators and the committee for the experiments, and all strangers to him, should be brought blindfolded into the room and caused to walk towards the line, without a word being spoken to indicate what was expected of them. The subjects moved along unsuspiciously until they came to the invisible barrier, when, as it is described, their feet, as if they had been suddenly seized and riveted, adhere to the ground, while their bodies, carried forward by the rapid impulse of the motion, fall and strike the floor. The sudden rigidity of their limbs was like that of a frozen corpse, and their heels were rooted with mathematical precision upon the fatal line. In another experiment, it was agreed that upon one of the physicians giving a certain signal by a glance of the eye, the blindfolded girl should be made to fall on the ground as if struck by lightning, and the magnetic fluid emanated by Regazzoni's will. She was placed at a distance from the magnetizer. The signal was given, and instantly the subject was felled to the earth, without a word being spoken or a gesture made. Involuntarily, one of the spectators stretched out his hand as if to catch her, but Regazzoni, in a voice of thunder, exclaimed, "Do not touch her! Let her fall! A magnetized subject is never hurt by falling." Desmousseau, who tells the story, says, "Marble is not more rigid than was her body. Her head did not touch the ground. One of her arms remained stretched in the air. One of her legs was raised, and the other horizontal. She remained in this unnatural position for an indefinite time. Less rigid is the statue of bronze." All the effects witnessed in the experiments of public lecturers upon mesmerism were produced by Regazzoni in perfection, and without one spoken word to indicate what the subject was to do. He even by his silent will produced the most surprising effects upon the physical systems of persons totally unknown to him. Directions whispered by the committee in Regazzoni's ear were immediately obeyed by the subjects, whose ears were stuffed with cotton and whose eyes were bandaged. Nay, in some cases it was not even necessary for them to express to the magnetizer what they desired, for their own mental requests were complied with perfect fidelity. Experiments of a similar character were made by Regazzoni in England, at a distance of 300 paces from the subject brought to him. The jettatura or evil eye, is nothing but the direction of this invisible fluid, charged with malicious will and hatred from one person to another, and sent out with the intention of harming him. It may equally be employed for a good or evil purpose. In the former case it is magic, in the latter, sorcery. What is the will? Can exact science tell? What is the nature of that intelligent, intangible, and powerful something which reigns supreme over all inert matter? The great universal idea willed, and the cosmos sprang into existence. I will, and my limbs obey. Kinda. I will, and my thoughts traversing space, which does not exist for it, envelops the body of another individual who is not part of myself, penetrates through his pores, and, superseding his own faculties, if they are weaker, forces him to a predetermined action. It acts like the fluid of a galvanic battery on the limbs of a corpse. The mysterious effects of attraction and repulsion are the unconscious agents of that will. Fascinations, such as we see exercised by some animals, by serpents over birds, for instance, is a conscious action of it, and the result of thought. Sealing wax, glass, and amber, when rubbed, in example, when the latent heat which exists in every substance is awakened, attract light bodies. They exercise unconsciously will, for inorganic as well as organic matter possesses a particle of the divine essence in itself, however infinitesimally small it may be. And how could it be otherwise, notwithstanding that in the progress of its evolution it may from the beginning to end have passed through millions of various forms? It must ever retain its germ point of that pre-existent matter, which is the first manifestation and emanation of the deity itself. What is then this inexplicable power of attraction but an atomical portion of that essence that scientists and Kabbalists equally recognize as the principle of life, the akasa? Granted that the attraction exercised by such bodies may be blind, but as we ascend higher the scale of the organic beings in nature, we find this principle of life developing attributes and faculties which become more determined and marked with every rung of the endless ladder. Man, the most perfect of organized beings on earth, in whom matter and spirit, i.e., will, are the most developed and powerful, is alone allowed to give a conscious impulse to that principle which emanates from him, and only he can impart to the magnetic fluid opposite and various impulses without limit as to the direction. He wills, says Depotet, and organized matter obeys. It has no poles. Dr. Bryer de Boismont, in his volume on hallucinations, reviews a wonderful variety of visions, apparitions, and ecstasies, generally termed hallucinations. We cannot deny, he says, that in sudden diseases we see developed a great surexcitation of sensibility, which lends to the senses a prodigious acuteness of perception. Thus, some individuals will perceive at considerable distances, others will announce the approach of persons who are really on their way, although those present can neither hear nor see them coming. A lucid patient, lying in his bed, announces the arrival of persons to see whom he must possess transmural vision, and this faculty is termed by Bryer de Boismont hallucination. In our ignorance we have hitherto innocently supposed that in order to be rightly termed a hallucination, a vision must be subjective. It must have an existence only in the delirious brain of the patient, but if the latter announces the visit of a person miles away, and this a person arrives at the very moment predicted by the seer, then this vision is no more subjective, but on the contrary, perfectly objective. For he saw that person in the act of coming, and how could the patient see, through solid bodies in space, an object shut out from the reach of our mortal sight if he had not exercised his spiritual eyes on that occasion? Coincidence? Cabanis speaks of certain nervous disorders in which patients easily distinguish with the naked eye infusoria and other microscopical beings which others could only perceive through powerful lenses. I have met subjects, he says, who saw in Cimmerian darkness as well as in lighted room. Others, who followed peasants, tracing them out like dogs and recognizing by the smell objects belonging to such peasants, or even such as had only been touched by them, with a sagacity which was hitherto observed only in animals. Smell is a very weird thing. I have the ability to smell sickness. Like, not everybody does, I've discovered, but I can smell the difference between a sinus infection and an ear infection. I can tell when you have a chest infection. I can tell when you have a stomach infection. I can smell the difference in your chemistry. It makes me a little bit weird. I am perfectly fine with being weird. And that is something that is separate from anything I do in meditative practice. Exactly. Because reason, which, as Cabanas says, develops only at the expense and loss of natural instinct, is a Chinese wall slowly rising on the soil of sophistry, and which finally shuts out man's spiritual perceptions, of which the instinct is one of the most important examples. Arrived at certain stages of physical prostration, when mind and the reasoning faculties seem paralyzed through weakness and bodily exhaustion, instinct, the spiritual unity of the five senses, sees, hears, feels, tastes, and smells, unimpaired by either time or space. What do we know of the exact limits of mental action? How can a physician take upon himself to distinguish the imaginary from the real senses in a man who may be living a spiritual life, in a body so exhausted of its usual vitality that it is actually unable to prevent the soul from oozing out from its prison? And again, it's not a prison. The divine light through which, unimpeded by matter, the soul perceives things past, present, and to come, as though their rays were focused in a mirror, the death-dealing bolt projected in an instant of fierce anger, or at the climax of long festering hate. The blessing wafted from a grateful or benevolent heart, and the curse hurled at an object, offender or victim, all have to pass through that universal agent, which under one impulse is the breath of God, and under another the venom of the devil. It was discovered by Baron Reichenbach and called OD. Whether intentionally or otherwise we cannot say, but it is singular that a name should have been chosen which is mentioned in the most ancient books of the Kabbalah. Our readers will certainly inquire, what then is this invisible all? How is it that our scientific methods, however perfected, have never discovered any of the magical properties contained in it? To this we can answer that it is no reason, because modern scientists are ignorant of them, that it should not possess all the properties with which the ancient philosophers endowed it. Science rejects many a thing today which she may find herself forced to accept tomorrow. A little less than a century ago, the Academy denied Franklin's electricity, and at the present day we can hardly find a house without a conductor on its roof. Shooting at the barn door, the Academy missed the barn itself. Modern scientists, by their willful skepticism and learned ignorance, do this very frequently. Emeft, the supreme first principle, produced an egg, by brooding over which and permeating the substance of it with its own vivifying essence, the germ contained within was developed, and Patha, the active creative principle, proceeded from it and began his work. From the boundless expanse of cosmic matter which had formed itself under his breath, or will, this cosmic matter, astral light, ether, fire, mist, principle of life, it matters not how we may call it, this creative principle, or, as our modern philosophy terms it, law of evolution, by setting in motion the potencies latent in it, formed suns and stars and satellites, controlled their emplacement by the immutable law of harmony, and peopled them with every form and quality of life. In the ancient Eastern mythologies, the cosmogonic myth states that there was but water, the father, and the prolific slime, the mother, Elus, or Hyle, from which crept forth the mundane snake matter. It was the god Phanes, the revealed one, the word, or logos. How willingly this myth was accepted, even by the Christians who compiled the New Testament, may be easily inferred from the following fact. Phanes, the revealed god, is represented in this snake symbol as a protagonist, a being furnished with the heads of a man, hawk, or an eagle, a bull, and a lion, with wings on both sides. The heads relate to the zodiac and typify the 4 seasons of the year. For the mundane serpent is the mundane year, while the serpent itself is the symbol of Kneph, the hidden or unrevealed deity, God the Father. Time is winged, therefore the serpent is represented with wings. If we remember that each of the 4 evangelists is represented as having near him one of the described animals, grouped together in Solomon's triangle in the pentacle of Ezekiel, and to be found in the 4 cherubs or sphinxes of the sacred ark, we will perhaps understand the secret meaning, as well as the reason why the early Christians adopted this symbol, and how it is that the present Roman Catholics and the Greeks of the Oriental Church still represent these animals in pictures of their evangelists, which sometimes accompany the 4 Gospels. We will also understand why Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, had so insisted upon the necessity of the 4th Gospel, giving as a reason that there could not be less than 4 of them, as there were 4 zones in the world and 4 principal winds coming from the 4 cardinal points, etc. According to one of the Egyptian myths, the phantom form of the Isle of Chemis, Kimi in Egypt, which floats about on the ethereal waves of the Empyrean sphere, was being called into being by Horus, Apollo, the sun god, who caused it to evolve out of the mundane egg. In the cosmogonical poem of Voluspa, the Song of the Prophetess, which contains the Scandinavian legends of the very dawn of ages, the phantom germ of the universe is represented as lying in the Genugagap, or cup of illusion, a boundless and void abyss. In this world's matrix, formerly a region of night and desolation, Nebelheim, the mist place, dropped a ray of cold light, ether, which overflowed this cup and froze in it. Then the invisible blew a scorching wind, which dissolved the frozen waters and cleared the mist. These waters, called the streams of Elvigar, distilled in vivifying drops, which, falling down, created the earth and the giant Ymir, who only had the semblance of a man, male principle. With him was created the cow, Audhumla, female principle, from whose udder flowed 4 streams of milk, which diffused themselves throughout space, the astral light in its purest emanation. The cow, Audhumla, produces a superior being, called Bur, handsome and powerful, by licking the stones that were covered with mineral salt. Now, if we take into consideration that this mineral was universally regarded by ancient philosophers as one of the chief formative principles in organic creation, by the alchemists as the universal menstruum, which, they said, was to be wrought from water, and by everyone else, even as it is regarded now by science as well as in the popular ideas, to be an indispensable ingredient for man and beast, we may readily comprehend the hidden wisdom of this allegory of the creation of man. Paracelsus calls salt the center of water wherein metals ought to die, etc. The Van Helmont terms the alkahest summum et felicissimum aminum salium, the most successful of all salts. In the Gospel according to Matthew, Jesus says, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted?" And following the parable, he adds, "Ye are the light of the world." This is more than an allegory. These words point to a direct and unequivocal meaning in relation to the spiritual and physical organisms of man in his dual nature, and show, moreover, a knowledge of the secret doctrine, and traces of which we will find equally in the oldest, ancient, and current popular traditions, in both the Old and New Testaments, and in the writings of the ancient and medieval mystics and philosophers. But to return to our Edda legend, Ymir, the giant, falls asleep and sweats profusely. The perspiration causes the pit of his left arm to generate out of that place a man and a woman, while his foot produces a son for them. Thus, while the mythic cow gives being to a race of superior spiritual men, the giant Ymir begets a race of evil and depraved men, the Hrimthursum, or frost giants. Comparing notes with the Hindu Vedas, we find it then, with slight modifications, the same cosmogonic legend in substance and details. Brahma, as soon as Bhagavata, the supreme god, endows him with creative powers, produces animated beings, wholly spiritual at first. The Dijotas, inhabitants of the Surgs, the celestial region, are unfit to live on earth. Therefore Brahma creates the Dayants, giants, who become the dwellers of the Patals, the lower region of space, who are also unfit to inhabit Mirtlok, the earth. To palliate the evil, the creative powers evolves from his mouth the first Brahman, who thus becomes the progenitor of our race. From his right arm, Brahma creates Rayatris, the warrior, and from his left, Shatarani, the wife of Rayatris. When their son Bais springs from the right foot of the creator, and his wife Basani from the left. While in the Scandinavian legend, Bur, the son of the cow Adhuma, a superior being, marries Besla, a daughter of the depraved race of giants. In the Hindu tradition, the first Brahmin marries Daintari, also a daughter of the race of the giants, and in Genesis we see the sons of God taking for wives the daughters of men, and likewise producing mighty men of old, the whole establishing an unquestionable identity of origin between the Christian-inspired book and the heathen fables of Scandinavia and Hindustan. The traditions of nearly every other nation, if examined, will yield a like result. What modern cosmogonist could compress within so simple a symbol as the Egyptian serpent in his circle such a world of meaning? Here we have, in this creature, the whole philosophy of the universe, matter vivified by spirit, and the two conjointly evolving out of chaos, force, everything that was to be. To signify that the elements are fast bound in this cosmic matter, which the serpent symbolizes, the Egyptians tied his tail into a knot. There is one more important emblem connected with the sloughing of the serpent skin, which, so far as we are aware, has never been heretofore noticed by our symbolist. As the reptile, upon casting his coat, becomes freed from a casing of gross matter, which cramped a body grown too large for it, and resumes its existence with renewed activity, so man, by casting off the gross material body, enters upon the next stage of his existence with enlarged powers and quickened vitality. Inversely, the Chaldean Kabbalists tell us that primeval man, who, contrary to the Darwinian theory, was purer, wiser, and far more spiritual, as shown by the myths of the Scandinavian Bur, the Hindu Dijotas, and the Mosaic sons of God. In short, of a far higher nature than the man of the present Adamic race, became despiritualized or tainted with matter, and then, for the first time, was given the fleshly body, which is typified in Genesis in that profoundly significant verse. Unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skin and clothe them. No, right? It is possible that this allegory is true. I will hold that. But what is being stated in there is that they became aware of their nakedness, which implies that they already had skin. Right? Like, am I wrong for that? Like, that absolutely makes sense to me. They were unaware of their nakedness. They were existing in a primordial state of just going around and grabbing the fruit and eating it. And then they became aware, which was the sin, right? Becoming aware that sin was a thing. The ability to make choices, all of those things. But you already had a coat of skin. Unless the commentators would make of the first cause a celestial tailor. And I do, because I do not believe that any God who is walking along the mortal plane was actually God. There was an entity, possibly one of these giants, who worked with these creatures that he created in order to regulate the system of the earth. It's the best way to put it, right? You were to be a steward of the earth. And once they were aware that they were naked, did indeed make them clothes. Important note to note that they couldn't do it themselves because they were not allowed to eat meat until after the flood. What else can the apparently absurd words mean but that the spiritual man had reached, through the progress of evolution, to that point where matter, predominating over and conquering spirit, had transformed him into the physical man, or the second Adam of the second chapter of Genesis. This Kabbalistic doctrine is much more elaborated in the book of Jasher. In chapter 7, these garments of skin are taken by Noah into the ark, he having obtained them by inheritance from Methuselah and Enoch, who had them from Adam and his wife. Ham steals them from his father Noah and gives them in secret to Cush, who conceals them from his sons and brothers and passes them to Nimrod. I haven't done the book of Jasher. Maybe I should, but that also, right? Maybe I did skim it when we were doing Enoch. But most of what is contained in those books are just simply incredulous. While some Kabbalists and even archaeologists say that Adam, Enoch, and Noah might, in outward appearance, be different men, but that they were really the self-same divine person. Others explain that between Adam and Noah there intervened several cycles. That is to say that every one of the antediluvian patriarchs stood as the representative of a race, which had its place in a succession of cycles, and each of which races was less spiritual than its predecessor. Thus, Noah, though a good man, could not have borne comparison with his ancestor Enoch, who walked with God and did not die. Hence the allegorical interpretation, which makes Noah have this coat of skin by inheritance from the second Adam and Enoch, but not wear it for himself, for if otherwise, Ham could not have stolen it. But Noah and his children bridged the flood, and while the former belonged to the old and still spiritual antediluvian generation, inasmuch as he was selected from all mankind for his purity, his children were post-diluvian. The coat of skin worn by Cush in secret, in example, when his spiritual nature began to be tainted by the material, is placed on Nimrod, the most powerful and strongest of the physical men on this side of the flood, the last remnant of the antediluvian giants. Unless you take into account, Goliath, or any of the various giants described in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. That's well after the flood, right? That would be remnants, right? In the Scandinavian legend, Ymir, the giant, is slain by the sons of Bur, and the streams of blood flowing from his wounds were so copious that the flood drowned the whole race of ice and frost giants. And Bergelmir, alone of that race, was saved, and his wife, by taking refuge in a bark, which fact permitted him to transmit a new branch of giants from the old stock. But all the sons of Bur remained untouched by the flood. When the symbolism of this Diluvian legend is unraveled, one perceives at once the real meaning of the allegory. The giant Ymir typifies the primitive, rude organic matter, the blind cosmical forces in their chaotic state, before they receive the intelligent impulse of the divine spirit, which set them into a regular motion, dependent upon immovable laws. The progeny of Bur are the sons of God, or the minor gods, mentioned by Plato in the Timaeus, who were entrusted, as he expressed it, with the creation of men. For we see them taking the mangled reins of Ymir to the Ginnuga gap, the chaotic abyss, and employing them for the creation of our world. His blood goes to form oceans and rivers, his bones the mountains, his teeth the rocks and cliffs, his hair, the trees, etc., while his skull forms the heavenly vault supported by 4 pillars representing the 4 cardinal points. From the eyebrows of Ymir was created the future abode of man, Midgard. This abode, the earth, says the Edda, in order to be correctly described in all its minute particulars, must be conceived as round as a ring, or as a disk, floating in the middle of the celestial ocean, ether. It is encircled by Jormungand, the gigantic Midgard or earth serpent, holding its tail in its mouth. This is the mundane snake, matter and spirit, combined product and emanation of Ymir, the gross rudimental matter, and of the spirit of the sons of God, who fashioned and created all forms. This emanation is the astral light of the Kabbalist, and the as yet problematical and hardly known ether, or the hypothetical agent of great elasticity of our physicists. How sure the ancients were of this doctrine of man's trinitarian nature may be inferred from the same Scandinavian legend of the creation of mankind. According to the Voluspa, Odin, Honir, and Lodur, who are the progenitors of our race, found in one of their walks on the ocean beach 2 sticks floating on the waves, powerless and without destiny. Odin breathed in them the breath of life, Honir endowed them with soul and motion, and Lodur with beauty, speech, sight, and hearing. The man they called Askr, the ash, and the woman Embla, the alder. These first men are placed in Midgard, or Eden, and thus inherit from their creators matter or inorganic life, mind or soul, and pure spirit, the first corresponding to that part of their organism which sprung from the remains of Ymir, the giant matter, the second from the Elixir, or gods, the descendants of Bur, and the third from the Vanir, or the representative of pure spirit, so body, soul, and spirit. Another version of the Edda makes our invisible universe spring from beneath the luxuriant branches of the mundane tree, the Yggdrasil, the tree with the 3 roots. Under the first root runs the fountain of life, Urdar. Under the second is the famous well of Mimir, in which lie deeply buried wit and wisdom. Odin, the Alfadir, asks for a draught of this water. He gets it, but finds himself obliged to pledge one of his eyes for it, the eye being in this case the symbol of the deity, revealing itself in the wisdom of its own creation. For Odin leaves it at the bottom of the deep well. The care of the mundane tree is entrusted to 3 maidens, the Norns or Parsee, Erdtir, Verdandi, and Skuld, or the present, the past, and the future. Every morning, while fixing the term of human life, they draw water from the Eldar fountain, and sprinkle it with the roots of the mundane tree, that it may live. The exhalations of the ash, Yggdrasil, condense, and falling down upon our earth, call into existence and change the form every portion of inanimate matter. This tree is the symbol of the universal life, organic as well as inorganic. Its emanations represent the spirit which vivifies every form of creation, and of its 3 roots. One extends to heaven, the second to the dwelling of the magicians, giants, inhabitants of the lofty mountains, and at the third, under which is the spring Hevelgrimir, gnaws the monster Nidog, who constantly leads mankind into evil. The Tibetans have also their mundane tree, and the legend is of an untold antiquity. With them it is called Zampun. The first of its 3 roots also extends to heaven, and to the top of the highest mountains. The second passes down to the lower region, and the third remains midway and reaches to the east. The mundane tree of the Hindus is the Aswatha. Its branches are the components of the visible world, and its leaves the mantras of the Vedas, symbols of the universe and its intellectual or moral character. Who can study carefully the ancient religious and cosmogonic myths without perceiving that this is striking similitude of conceptions, in their exoteric form and esoteric spirit, is the result of no mere coincidence, but manifest a concurrent design. It shows that already in those ages, which are shut out from our sight by the impenetrable mist of tradition, human religious thought developed in uniform sympathy in every portion of the globe. Christians call this adoration of nature in her most concealed verities pantheism. But if the latter, which worships and reveals to us God in space in his only possible objective form, that of visible nature, perpetually reminds humanity of him who created it, and a religion of theological dogmatism only serves to conceal him the more from our sight, which is the better adapted to the needs of mankind? Modern science insists upon the doctrine of evolution. So do human reason and the secret doctrine, and the idea is corroborated by the ancient legends and myths, and even by the Bible itself when it is read between the lines. We see a flower slowly developing from a bud and the bud from its seed. But whence the latter, with all its predetermined program of physical transformation, and its invisible, therefore spiritual forces, which gradually develop its form, color, and odor? The word, evolution, speaks for itself. The germ of the present human race must have pre-existed in the parent of this race, as the seed, in which lies hidden the flower of the next summer, was developed in the capsule of a parent flower. The parent may be slightly different, but it still differs from its future progeny. The antediluvian ancestors of the present elephant and lizard were, perhaps, the mammoth and the plesiosaurus. Why should not the progenitors of our human race have been the giants of the Vedas, the Voluspa, and the Book of Genesis? While it is positively absurd to believe the transformation of species to have taken place according to some of the more materialistic views of the evolutionists, it is but natural to think that each genus, beginning with the mollusk and ending with the monkey man, has modified from its own primordial and distinctive form. Supposing that we concede that animals have descended from, at most, only 4 or 5 progenitors, and that even a la rigueur, all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form. Still, no one but a stone-blind materialist, one utterly devoid of intuitiveness, can seriously expect to see, in the distant future, psychology based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. Physical man, as a product of evolution, may be left in the hands of the man of exact science. None but he can throw light upon the physical origin of the race. But we must positively deny the materialist the same privilege as the question of man's psychical and spiritual evolution, for he and his highest faculties cannot be proved on any conclusive evidence to be as much products of evolution as the humblest plant or the lowest worm. Having said so much, we will now proceed to show the evolution hypothesis of the old Brahmins, as embodied by them in the allegory of the mundane tree. The Hindus represent their mythical tree, which they call Aswatha, in a way which differs from that of the Scandinavians. It is described by them as growing in a reversed position, its branches extending downward and its roots upwards. The former typifying the eternal world of sense, in example, the visible cosmical universe, and the latter the invisible world of spirit, because the roots had their genesis in the heavenly regions, where, from the world's creation, humanity has placed its invisible deity. The creative energy, having originated in the primordial point, the religious symbols of every people, are so many illustrations of this metaphysical hypothesis expounded by Pythagoras, Plato, and other philosophers. These Chaldeans, says Philo, were of an opinion that the cosmos, among the things that exist, is a single point, either being itself God, Theos, or that in it is God, comprehending the soul of all things. The Egyptian pyramid also symbolically represents this idea of the mundane tree. Its apex is the mystic link between heaven and earth, and stands for the root, while the base represents the spreading branches, extending to the four cardinal points of the universe of matter. That seems to be a self-insertion right there. I do not know that there is anything that actually says that the pyramid is built upside down, right? That it is meant to be a symbol of being built upside down. It conveys the idea that all things had their origin in spirit, evolution having originally begun from above and proceeded downward, instead of the reverse, as taught in the Darwinian theory. Sorry. In other words, there has been a gradual materialization of forms until a fixed ultimate of debasement is reached. This point is that at which the doctrine of modern evolution enters into the arena of speculative hypothesis. Arrived at this period, we will find it easier to understand Haeckel's anthropogeny, which traces the pedigree of man from its protoplasmic root, sodden in the mud of seas which existed before the oldest of the fossiliferous rocks were deposited, according to Professor Huxley's exposition. We may believe man evolved by gradual modification of a mammal of ape-like organization, still easier when we remember that, though in a more condensed and less elegant, but still as comprehensible phraseology, the same theory was said by Berosus to have been taught many thousands of years before his time by the man-fish Oans or Dagon, the semi-demon of Babylonia. We may add, as a fact of interest, that this ancient theory of evolution was not only embalmed in allegory and legend, but also depicted upon the walls of certain temples in India, and, in a fragmentary form, has been found in those of Egypt and in the slabs of Nimrud and Nineveh, excavated by Layard. But what lies back of the Darwinian line of descent? So far as he is concerned, nothing but unvariable hypotheses. For, as he puts it, he views all beings as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited. He does not attempt to show us who those few beings were, but it answers our purpose quite as well, for in the admission of their existence at all, resort to the ancients for corroboration and elaboration of the idea receives the stamp of scientific approbation. With all the changes that our globe has passed through as regards temperature, climate, soil, and, if we may be pardoned, in view of recent developments, its electromagnetic condition, it would be bold indeed to say who dared to say that anything in present science contradicts the ancient hypothesis of the anti-Silurian man. Sorry. The flint axes found by Boucher de Perth in the valley of the Somme prove that men must have existed at a period so remote as to be beyond calculation. If we believe Buchner, man must have lived even during and before the glacial epoch, a subdivision of the Quaternary or Diluvial period, probably extending far back into it. But who can tell what the next discovery has in store for us? Now, if we have indisputable proof that man has existed as long as this, there must have been wonderful modifications of his physical system, corresponding with the changes of climate and atmosphere. Does not this seem to show by analogy that, tracing backwards, there may have been other modifications which fitted the most remote progenitors of the frost giants to live even contemporaneously with the Devonian fishes or Silurian mollusks? True, they left no flint hatchets behind them, nor any bones or cave deposits. But, if the ancients are correct, the races at that time were composed not only of giants or mighty men of renown, but also of sons of God. If those who believe in the evolution of spirit as firmly as the materialists believe in that of matter are charged with teaching unverifiable hypotheses, how readily can they retort upon their accusers by saying that, by their own confession, their physical evolution is still an unverified, if not actually an unverifiable, hypothesis? The former have, at least, the inferential proof of a legendary myth, the vast antiquity of which is admitted by both philologists and archaeologists, while their antagonists have nothing of a similar nature unless they help themselves to a portion of the ancient picture writings and suppress the rest. It is more than fortunate that, while the works of some men of science, who have justly won their great reputations, will flatly contradict our hypotheses, the researches and labors of others not less eminent seem to fully confirm our views. In the recent work of Mr. Alfred R. Wallace, The Geographical Distribution of Animals, we find the author seriously favoring the idea of some slow process of development of the present species from others which have preceded them, his idea extending back over an innumerable series of cycles. And if animals, why not animal man, proceeded still further back by a thoroughly spiritual one, a son of God. And now, we may once more return to the symbology of the older times and their physico-religious myths. Before we close this work, we hope to demonstrate more or less successfully how closely the conceptions of the latter were allied with many of the achievements of modern science in physics and natural philosophy. Under the emblematical devices and peculiar phraseology of the priesthood of old lie latent hints of sciences as yet undiscovered during the present cycle. Well acquainted as may be a scholar with the hieratic writings and the hieroglyphical system of the Egyptians, he must first of all learn to sift their records. He has to assure himself, compasses and rule in hand, that the picture writing he is examining fits, to a line, certain fixed geometrical figures which are hidden keys to such records, before he ventures on an interpretation. But there are myths which speak for themselves. In this class we may include the double-sexed first creators of every cosmogony, the Greek Zeus, Zen, Aether, and Chthoniya, the chaotic earth, and Metis, the water, his wives, Osiris and Isis Latona, the former god representing also Ether, the first emanation of the supreme deity, Ammon, the primeval source of light, the goddess earth and water again, Mithras, the rock-born god, the symbol of the male mundane fire, or the personified primordial light, and Mithra, the fire goddess, at once his mother and his wife, the pure element of fire, the active or male principle, regarded as light and heat, in conjunction with earth and water, or matter, female or passive elements of cosmical generation. Mithras is the son of Mord, the Persian mundane mountain, from which he flashes out as a radiant ray of light. Brahma, the fire god, and his prolific consort, and the Hindu Ungi, the refulgent deity, from whose body issue 1,000 streams of glory and 7 tongues of flame, and in whose honor the Sagniku Brahmins preserve to this day a perpetual fire. Siva, personated by the mundane mountain of the Hindus, the Meru, Himalaya. This terrific fire god, who is said in the legend to have descended from heavens, like the Jewish Jehovah, in a pillar of fire, and a dozen of other archaic, double-sexed deities, all loudly proclaim their hidden meaning. And what can these dual myths mean but the physico-chemical principle of primordial creation? The first revelation of the supreme cause in its triple manifestation of spirit, force, and matter, the divine correlation. At its starting point of evolution, allegorized as the marriage of fire and water, products of electrifying spirit, union of the male active principle with the female passive element, which becomes the parents of their Tellurian child, cosmic matter, the prima materia, whose spirit is ether, the astral light. Thus, all the world mountains and mundane eggs, the mundane trees and the mundane snakes and pillars, may be shown to embody scientifically demonstrated truths of natural philosophy. All of these mountains contain, with very trifling variations, the allegorically expressed description of a primal cosmogony. The mundane trees, that of subsequent evolution of spirit and matter, the mundane snakes and pillars, symbolical memorials of the various attributes of this double evolution and its endless correlation of cosmic forces. Within the mysterious recesses of the mountain, the matrix of the universe, the gods, powers, prepare the atomic germs of organic life, and at the same time, the life drink, which, when tasted, awakens in man matter the man spirit. The soma, the sacrificial drink of the Hindus, is that sacred beverage. For at the creation of the primal material, while the grossest portions of it were used for the physical embryo world, the more divine essence of it pervaded the universe, invisibly permeating and enclosing within its ethereal waves the newly born infant, developing and stimulating it to activity as it slowly evolved out of the ethereal chaos. From the poetry of abstract conception, these mundane myths gradually passed into the concrete images of cosmic symbols, as archaeology now finds them. The snake, which plays such a prominent part in the imagery of the ancients, was degraded by the absurd interpretation of the serpent in the book of Genesis into a synonym of Satan, the prince of darkness, whereas it is the most ingenious of all the myths in its various symbolisms. For one, as Agathodaimon, it is the emblem of the healing art and of the immortality of man. It encircles the image of the most sanitary or hygienic gods. The cup of health, in the Egyptian mysteries, was entwined by serpents. As evil can only arise from an extreme in good, the serpent, under some other aspects, became typical of matter, which, the more it recedes from its primal spiritual source, the more it becomes subject of evil. In the oldest Egyptian imagery, as in the cosmogonic allegories of Kneph, the mundane snake, when typifying matter is usually represented as contained within a circle. He lies straight across its equator, thus indicating that the universe of astral light, out of which the physical world evolved, while bounding the latter, is itself bound by Infinite, or the supreme first cause. Ptah, producing Ra, and the myriad forms to which it gives life are shown as creeping out of the mundane egg, because it is the most familiar form of that in which is deposited and developed the germ of every living being. When the serpent represents eternity and immortality, it encircles the world, biting its tail, and thus offering no solution of continuity. It then becomes the astral light. The disciples of the school of Pherecydes taught that ether, Zeus or Zen, is the highest empyrean heaven, which encloses the supernal world, and its light, the astral, is the concentrated primordial element. Such is the origin of the serpent, metamorphized in Christian ages into Satan. It is the Od, the Ob, and the Or of Moses and the Kabbalist. When it is in passive state, when it acts on those who are unwittingly drawn within its current, the astral light is the Ob, or Python. Moses was determined to exterminate all those who, sensitive to its influence, allowed themselves to fall under the easy control of the vicious beings which move in the astral waves like fish in the water. Beings who surround us, and whom Bulwer Lytton calls the Zanoni, the dwellers of the threshold. It becomes the Od as soon as it is vivified by the conscious influx of an immortal soul. For then the astral currents are acting under the guidance of either an adept, a pure spirit, or an able mesmerizer, who is pure himself and knows how to direct the blind forces. In such cases, even a high planetary spirit, one of the class of beings that have never been embodied, though there are many among these hierarchies who have lived on our earth, descends occasionally to our sphere, and, purifying the surrounding atmosphere, enables the subject to see, and opens in him the springs of true divine prophecy. As to the term Aor, the word is used to designate certain occult properties of the universal agent. It pertains more directly to the domain of the alchemist, and is of no interest to the general public. The author of the Homo-Amarian system of philosophy, Anaxagoras of Clazomene, firmly believed that the spiritual prototypes of all things, as well as their elements, were to be found in the boundless ether, where they were generated, whence they had evolved, and whither they returned from earth. In common with the Hindus, who had personified their Akas, sky or ether, and made of it a deific entity, the Greeks and Latins had deified ether. Virgil calls Zeus Pater Omnipotens Aether, Magnus, the great god ether. These beings, above alluded to, are the elemental spirits of the Kabbalists, whom the Christian clergy denounces as devils, the enemies of mankind. Already Tertullian, gravely remarks Desmosu in his chapter on the devils, has formally discovered the secret of their cunning. A priceless discovery that, and now we have learned so much of the mental labors of the Holy Fathers and their achievements in astroanthropology, need we be surprised at all if, in the zeal of their spiritual explorations, they have so far neglected their own planet as, at times, to deny not only its right to motion, but even its veracity. And this is what we find in Langhorne, the translator of Plutarch. Dionysius of Halicarnassus is of the opinion that Numa built the temple of Vesta in a round form to represent the figure of the earth, for by Vesta they meant the earth. Moreover, Philolaus, in common with all other Pythagoreans, held that the element of fire was placed in the center of the universe, and Plutarch, speaking on the subject, remarks of the Pythagoreans that the earth they suppose not to be without motion or situated in the center of the world, but to make its revolution around the sphere of fire, being neither one of the most valuable nor principal parts of the great machine. Plato, too, is reported to have been of the same opinion. It appears, therefore, that the Pythagoreans anticipated Galileo's discovery. The existence of such an invisible universe being once admitted, as seems likely to be the fact, if speculations of the authors of the unseen universe are ever accepted by their colleagues, many of the phenomena, hitherto mysterious and inexplicable, become plain. It acts on the organism of the magnetized mediums. It penetrates and saturates them through and through, either directly by the powerful will of the mesmerizer, or by unseen beings who achieve the same result. Once that the silent operation is performed, the astral or sidereal phantom of the mesmerized subject quits its paralyzed earthly casket, and, after having roamed in the boundless space, alights at the threshold of the mysterious bourne. For it, the gates of the portal which mark the entrance to the silent land are now but partially ajar. They will fly wide open before the soul of the entranced somnambulist only on that day when, united with its higher immortal essence, it will have quitted forever its mortal frame. Until then, the seer or seeress can look but through a chink. It depends on the acuteness of the clairvoyant's spiritual sight to see more or less through it. The Trinity in unity is an idea which all the ancient nations held in common. The three Djotas, the Hindu Trimurti, the three heads of the Jewish Kabbalah. Three heads are hewn in one another and over one another. The Trinity of the Egyptians and that of the mythological Greeks were alike representations of the first triple emanation, containing two male and one female principles. It is the union of the male logos, or wisdom, the revealed deity, with the female aura, or anima mundi, the holy pneuma, which is the Sephira of the Kabbalists and the Sophia of the refined Gnostics, that produced all things, visible and invisible. While the true metaphysical interpretation of this universal dogma remained within the sanctuaries, the Greeks, with their poetical instincts, impersonated it in many charming myths. In the Dionysiacs of Nomnus, the god Bacchus, among other allegories, is represented as in love with the soft, genial breeze, the holy Pneuma, under the name of Aura Placida. And now we will leave Godfrey Higgins to speak. When the ignorant fathers were constructing their calendar, they made out of this gentle Zephyr 2 Roman Catholic saints, SS Aura and Placidia. Nay, they even went so far as to transfer the jolly god into St. Bacchus, and actually show his coffin and relics at Rome. The festival of the two blessed saints, Aura and Placidia, occurs on the 5th of October, close to the festival of St. Bacchus. How far more poetical and how much greater the religious spirit to be found in the heathen Norse legends of creation, in the boundless abyss of the mundane pit, the Ginnungagap gap, where rage and blind fury and conflict, cosmic matter and primordial forces. Suddenly blows the thaw wind. It is the unrevealed God who sends his beneficent breath from Muspelheim, the sphere of imperial fire, within whose glowing rays dwells this great being, far beyond the limits of the world of matter, and the animus of the unseen, the spirit, brooding over dark, abysmal waters, calls order out of chaos, and once having given the impulse to all creation, the first cause retires and remains forevermore in statu abscondito. There is both religion and science in these Scandinavian songs of heathendom. As an example of the latter, take the conception of Thor, the son of Odin. Whenever this Hercules of the North would grasp the handle of his terrible weapon, the thunderbolt or electric hammer, he is obliged to put on his iron gauntlets. He also wears a magical belt known as the Girdle of Strength, which, whenever girded about his person, greatly augments his celestial power. He rides upon a car, driven by two rams with silver bridles, and his awful brow is encircled by a wreath of stars. His chariot has a pointed iron pole, and the spark-scattering wheels continually roll over rumbling thunderclouds. He hurls his hammer with resistless force against the rebellious frost giants, whom he dissolves and annihilates. When he repairs to the Urdar fountain, where the gods meet in conclave to decide the destinies of humanity, he alone goes on foot, the rest of the deities being mounted. He walks, for fear that in crossing Bifrost, the rainbow, the many-hued Asa Bridge, he might set it on fire with his thunder car, at the same time causing the Urdar waters to boil. Rendered into plain English, how can this myth be interpreted but as showing that the Norse legend makers were thoroughly acquainted with electricity? Thor, the humorization of electricity, handles his peculiar element only when protected by gloves of iron, which is its natural conductor. His belt of strength is a closed circuit, around which the isolated current is compelled to run, instead of diffusing itself through space. When he rushes with his car through the clouds, he is electricity in its active condition, as the sparks scattering from his wheels and the rumbling of thunder of the clouds testify. The pointed iron pole of his chariot is suggestive of the lightning rod. The two rams which serve as his coursers are the familiar ancient symbols of the male or generative power. Their silver bridle typifies the female principle, for silver is the metal of Luna, Astarte, Diana. Therefore, in the ram and his bridle we see combined the active and passive principles of nature in opposition, one rushing forward and the other resisting, while both are in subordination to the world-permeating electrical principle which gives them their impulse, with the electricity supplying the impulse and the male and female principle combining and recombining in endless correlation. The result is evolution of a visible nature, the crowned glory of which is the planetary system, which in the mythic Thor is allegorized by the circlet of glittering orbs which bedeck his brow. When in his active condition, his awful thunderbolts destroy everything, even the lesser titanic forces. But he goes afoot over the Rainbow Bridge, Bifrost, because to mingle with the other less powerful gods than himself, he is obliged to be in a latent state, which he could not be in his car. Otherwise, he would set on fire and annihilate all. The meaning of the Ardar fountain, that Thor is afraid to make boil, and the cause of his reluctance, will only be comprehended by our physicists when the reciprocal electromagnetic relations of the innumerable members of the planetary system, just now suspected, shall be thoroughly determined. Glimpses of the truth are given in the recent scientific essays of Professors Meyer and Sterry Hunt. The ancient philosophers believed that not only volcanoes, but boiling springs were caused by concentrations of underground electric currents, and that this same cause produced mineral deposits of various natures, which formed curative springs. It would be objected that this fact is not distinctly stated by the ancient authors, who, in the opinion of our century, were hardly acquainted with electricity. We may simply answer that not all of the works embodying ancient wisdom are now extant among our scientists. The clear and cool waters of Ardar were required for the daily irrigation of the mystical mundane tree, and if they had been disrupted by Thor, or active electricity, they would have been converted into mineral springs, unsuited for the purpose. Such examples as the above will support the ancient claim of the philosophers that there is a logos in every mythos, or a groundwork of truth in every fiction. And that is going to bring us to the end of Part 5. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. I understand that I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I have a tendency to step on toes when I relay that. It is not intentional, but it is not something I apologize for. Finally, I have a little bit of something that I can actually talk about. I do have a little bit of knowledge about the Holy Spirit, or the fire, the electromagnetic forces of creation, of which electricity is definitely a part. I do not claim to have a full mastery, right? I am an adept at best, working my way along with others towards mastery. Whether I will achieve that on the mortal coil or not, who knows, but I will so endeavor. I do believe in magic. I believe in the manipulation of these electromagnetic forces of creation, which I believe is the Holy Spirit. It is the singular permeating force which penetrates everything. To me, God is. He is me, He is you, He is the space between me and you, and He is the space between me and you. He is everything you can see and everything that you cannot see, all at the same time, in perfect accord and harmony. You are an individualized section of that, a tiny little fragment of the divine, not divine in and of yourself, but a representative of the divine in a very real way, who has the ability to take at least a small measure of control of these forces. I have endeavored to show in the Infinite Integrations playlist and the Esoterica playlist the means by which I have done the things which I have done. It may not be clear, and that is why we do these studies, so that we can talk about the topics brought to light by the text. It gives me a jumping off point to talk about the things which I know, right? I talk often about how I try not to talk about things that I don't know. If I'm making a guess, I will tell you it's a guess. If it is an educated guess, I will tell you that it is an educated guess. If I am spitballing, I will tell you I am spitballing. If it is pulled entirely out of my ass, I will tell you that. I know that this manipulation is possible with 100% certainty. Whether it can be scientifically proven or not, I know. I have just talked to you for 2 hours, 23 minutes, and 54 seconds as of right now. That is a miracle to me. You can hear my voice get weaker as we go along through this, I am sure. The tone which I start with and the tone which I end with is not the same. But the fact that I can talk here in this tone of voice for this long is evidence that I have done this. You don't have to believe that. I'm here to tell you. I have done this. If you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment if you agree or disagree. If it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If there is a different work that you would like to see me work through in the manner that we are doing here, drop that in the comments as well. And if you really like what I'm doing here, hit me with that super thanks. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.